What Stone Age population could best represent the earliest descendants of Shem? Basically, what Stone Age population could best represent the ancestors of Semites? Because remember, after the flood, there would have been an Ice Age and a Stone Age. So what ancient people could best represent these descendants of Shem during the Stone Age? With that being said, there are perfect papers that answer this question. Perhaps the best paper that can help us with this investigation is titled Materials and Language Pre-Semitic Root Structure Change Concomitant with Transition to Agriculture. And it reads, materials and language have evolved together. Thus, the archaeological dating of materials possibly also dates the words which name them. Analysis of Proto-Semitic material terms reveals that materials discovered during the Neolithic are uniquely triconsonantal, whereas biconsonantal names were utilized for materials of the Stone Age. This establishes a major transition in pre-Semitic language structure, concomitant with the transition to agriculture. Associations of material names with other words in the Proto-Semitic lexicon reveal the original context of material utilization. In particular, monosyllabic 2C names are associated with a pre-Natufian cultural background, more than 16,500 years ago. Various augments introduced during the Natufian and perhaps even more intensively during the early Neolithic were absorbed into the roots, tilling the equilibrium from 2C towards 3C roots, and culminating in an agricultural society with strictly triconsonantal language morphology. The Proto-Semitic lexicon is highly suitable for addressing this problem. It postdates the transition to agriculture, yet is not too temporally distant for the hunter-gatherer lexicon to have been completely forgotten. Possibly then, it contains contributions from both civilizations. Proto-Semitic is based on some of the oldest documents in human history, which leads to reliable reconstructions. Yet it belongs to an era before the rise of the big empires, which mixed up populations and their languages. Proto-Afroasiatic, an older proto-language from which the Afroasiatic language families have evolved, might also be relevant to our discussion. In parallel to developing their communication skills, humans harnessed new materials and developed methods for processing them. The study of the history of chemistry and technology reveals the long and tortuous path involved in this endeavor. New materials evidently require new words for describing them. A main goal of the present work is thus to correlate Proto-Semitic material names from before and after the transition to agriculture with recent archaeological data. Also shown below, this reveals a major change in linguistic structure, in which biconsonantal 2C material names refer only to materials already known in the Old Stone Age, whereas materials discovered as of the Neolithic have only triconsonantal 3C names. In addition, we discussed the likely characteristic of the hunter-gatherer language that predated the transition, and suggest the schematic model for its development presented in Figure 1. So here is Figure 1, a model for the pre-Semitic language chronology and its relation with the corresponding archaeological periods in the southern Levant. So during the Upper Paleolithic and the pre-Natufian and Epi-Paleolithic, this was the geometric Kebaran culture. And looking at the pre-Semitic language chronology, we see that it was monosyllabic 2C. During the Natufian period, early Natufian and late Natufian, it was multisyllabic 2C. And during the pre-Pottery Neolithic, PPNA, PPNB, and PPNC, there was a transition. Then we entered the Pottery Neolithic with 3C, And then finally, we enter the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, where we finally get to Proto-Semitic, PS, Proto-Semitic. And again, we're looking at Figure 1, a model for the pre-Semitic language chronology and its relation with the corresponding archaeological periods in the southern Levant. Proto-Semitic stems from Old Stone Age pre-Semitic populations within the southern Levant, such as the Kebaran and the Natufian. Prehistoric chronology is geographically independent. In present work, it is based on the prehistory of West Asia and particularly the archaeology of the Levant. The Fertile Crescent, and notably Israel, is one of the more intensively investigated regions archaeologically. By contrast, archaeological studies of Africa, particularly for the pre-Neolithic era discussed herein, are very rudimentary. Thus, archaeological findings from the Levant may be interpreted as representative of their time rather than their precise location. More fundamentally, the Levant is unique in hosting the Natufian culture circa 15,000 through 11,700 BP. Table 1. Raw materials in Semitic languages classified according to Rose, the period in Levantine prehistory of their first utilization. This is Table 1, and at the top row there's materials, then there's Biblical Hebrew, BH, then there's Akkadian, 2C, and 3C. And all Table 1 is showing is the pronunciation of these Semitic words. Again, the Semitic words are under materials such as water, fire, light, rock, flint, pebble, stone, wet clay, mud, sand, dirt, wood, pole, stick, leather, tendon, clothes, lime, and reeds. And again, the key Semitic languages being used is Biblical Hebrew and Akkadian. And then we have 2C. Now look at the similarities between Biblical Hebrew, Akkadian, and 2C. Remember, 2C is from the pre-Natufian period, the geometric Kebaran period, but 2C is also in the Natufian period, the early Natufian, and the late Natufian. So we can actually see how Semitic languages do indeed come from these old Stone Age populations in the southern Levant, namely the Kebaran and the Natufian. Again, look at 2C, which is pre-Natufian and Natufian, and then look at the Akkadian and Biblical Hebrew when it comes to the materials, when it comes to the words and the pronunciations. It all derives from 2C, Old Stone Age populations in the southern Levant. Again, Kebaran and Natufian. Perhaps this is because these Semitic populations descend from these old Stone Age populations in the southern Levant, namely, again, the Kebaran and the Natufian. Perhaps these are the ancestors of Semitic populations. Up to the Natufian, the classical nomadic lifestyle of the hunter-gatherer prevailed, more or less as it existed during the Upper Paleolithic. The Natufians contributed a more complex society, with innovations in sedentary and hunting techniques, among other things. They are accredited for introducing the sickle and the bow. It is possible that this was a trigger for the development of a more complex language, Proto-Afro-Asiatic, PAA. The transition to agriculture in the Levant began earlier than in other regions of the world. In the pre-pottery Neolithic A, PPNA, 11,700 through 10,500 BP, and it was essentially complete by the pre-pottery Neolithic B, PPNB, 10,500 through 9,000 BP, when large agricultural villages were established. Pottery was introduced during or slightly before the pottery Neolithic, PN, 8,500 through 7,000 BP, whereas the first metal-producing installations are from the Chalcolithic period, 7,000 through 5,500 BP. Proto-Semitic is attributed to this period, and therefore it is the most recent period relevant to our Proto-Semitic reconstructions. Nevertheless, we advance one step further in time to discuss Proto-West Semitic words as well, which already belong to the early Bronze Age. Table 1 clearly shows that as of the early Neolithic, all novel materials received 3C names. It appears there are almost no exceptions to this rule. This provides quite convincing evidence for a language morphology change occurring roughly concomitant with the transition to agriculture, when a strictly 3C morphology was imposed. As will be demonstrated in detail in the next section, the Stone Ages allow one to connect language with the culture of the people who created it. Indeed, certain associations are meaningful and understandable only in light of the background of their period of inception, whereas at later periods the connection may have been totally forgotten. When implemented based on varied archaeological evidence, this provides an additional useful means of dating words, supporting the supposition that the 2C words in the Proto-Semitic lexicon were coined before, in fact, long before the transition to agriculture. In this section, we discuss Proto-Semitic and Proto-West Semitic names of materials whose use goes back to the Old Stone Age. These tend to be of 2C morphology, and their Stone Ages can consistently be understood as based on the hunter-gatherer way of life. Just as a disclaimer, I'm only going to read one, but check out the paper if you want to read all of the other names, material names that connect with pre-Neolithic and Proto-Semitic. Water and fire have been two basic elements of human survival since the dawn of prehistory. The substance water, Proto-Semitic me or mai, has a unique and universal 2C name in all Semitic languages. Flint is abundant in the Middle East and North Africa, but not in East Africa, from where modern humans are believed to have originated. The rock-flint association is found both in Semitic and Berber, implying knowledge of the natural occurrence of flint within limestone sediments. Thus, the ancestors of Berber and Semitic speakers must have lived in a region where flint was available in Cretaceous rocks. Stones were used for building houses only as of the geometric Kerbian 17,000 through 15,000 BP and the early Natufian circa 15,000 through 13,000 BP. The weak root bin, build, is attested in all Semitic languages. Thus, it is possibly an extension of the root underlying bin, stone. Such a development must have occurred before the bin or bin transition, hence bin is possibly a Kerbian or Natufian innovation. As of the PPNA, building in stone became widespread, and therefore building was no longer exclusively associated with stone. The first stone buildings were circular, and they dominated architecture throughout the Natufian and PPNA periods. A rather abrupt and complete transition to rectangular houses occurred with the establishment of the larger PPNB villages. A fine example for this transition, around 10,500 BP, is found in Syria. Thereafter, round houses were seldom constructed. Interestingly, Proto-Semitic contains several 2C roots for round/circle, such as gul and der, but none for square. This attests to a special affinity that the hunter-gatherer culture may have had with circular geometry. From the root der, we have Arabic dar, house, dwelling. Its sole cognate in the Hebrew Bible, dor, Isaiah chapter 38, verse 12, is often interpreted as a circular tent camp. Yet this verse in Isaiah contrasts dor as a symbol of longevity with an ephemeral shepherd's tent. Thus, dor must be a stable house, not a tent, and this is likely also the origin of the village names Dor and Indor in Israel. The Akkadian cognate Duor means circular city, wall, a sturdy construction which is not movable like a tent. The common denominator for a reconstructed Proto-Semitic Dar would be a house with solid round walls. A reasonable explanation is that this term used to denote the Natufian roundhouse until circa 10,500 BP. As this structure disappeared, the term was borrowed to denote a round wall in East Semitic and a permanent dwelling in West Semitic. Possibly then, Dar dates back to the inception of the round architecture, 16,500 BP, when a new terminology was required to differentiate it from the brush huts which prevailed during the Upper Paleolithic. The round house is so characteristic to the Natufian/PPNA Levant that the above interpretation implies, if correct, that pre-Semitic speakers have occupied the Levant at least as of the Epi-Paleolithic period. It may thus seem counterintuitive that archaeologically reveals that limestone, Proto-West Semitic, gur, predated gypsum utilization. Figure 3a shows a 16,500-year-old flint blade from a geometric Kerbian site in northern Sinai. So this is figure 3a and b, and at the top A is gur limestone, which is found only within the Levant. And remember, this limestone flint blade was from the geometric Kerbian site in northern Sinai, and this was an ancient culture of people who lived in the Levant. Many of their words and terminology becoming the Proto-Semitic languages of the early Bronze Age. And again, all of this originates in the Levant with the Kerbian Natufian cultures, the Stone Age cultures from 16,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. These populations are the predecessors to the Semitic tongue, and perhaps even the Semitic people. Subsequently, early Natufians utilized lime plasters in building, as evidenced by the lime kiln found in Hayanum Cave, West Galilee, Israel, 14,000 BP. The fact that both terms connected with the lime processing and utilization, Proto-West Semitic gur and Proto-Semitic chur, are 2C is in accord with the archaeological evidence for the early introduction of lime kilns in the early Natufian or even Kerbian periods. As figure 3b shows, there was a clear geographic separation between lime plasters in the Levant and gypsum plasters in Mesopotamia during the PPN. The absence of an East Semitic cognate for lime, Proto-West Semitic gur, in this case may be due to the fact that lime was not frequently used in Neolithic Mesopotamia, and this word thus underwent rapid replacement. Earlier suggestions that West Semitic chur is an Akkadian loanword have recently been rejected, thus leading to better agreement with the archaeological findings of lime kilns in the Levant. The denomination of Quan from Qua'an parallels the suggested denomination of Ben, to build, from Ba'un, stone, and hence it should tentatively be assigned to the same period, geometric Kerbian/Natufian. This period, which followed the last glacial maximum, LMG circa 25,000 BP, saw the receding of Lake Lisson that connected the Dead Sea with the Sea of Galilee during the LMG. Reeds might have proliferated in the marshes left behind the drying lake, possibly resulting in increased reed utilization as manifested by the above Stone Age. Another Proto-Semitic word for clothes, kisut, is considered to originate from the Proto-Semitic word kis, cover, with the feminine ending t. If indeed CVCY roots are an innovation of the Kerbian/Natufian period, or later, kisut would denote a later type of clothes than sit, perhaps a garment that covers the whole body, as opposed to the UP loincloth. During the early Neolithic, flax was domesticated. The first evidence for cultivated flax is from Tel Ramad in Syria, circa 9000 BP. Neolithic material names. In this section, we discuss materials discovered in the first few millennia following the agricultural revolution, and show that their names all have 3C morphology. A. Sun-baked mud bricks were first utilized for building in PPNA sites of the Jordan Valley, Israel, and northern Mesopotamia, Nimrik near Mosul, Iraq. It became readily available after PPNA wheat domestication. There are Proto-Semitic words for both brick and straw, and they already possess 3C structure. It thus appears that the PPNA transition to agriculture correlates with the transition in language structure. D. Pottery. Clay statuettes were produced in the Upper Paleolithic UP long before the manufacture of pottery. In agreement with this finding, Proto-Semitic tin, clay, has CVC morphology. In the Levant, fired clay vessels that can hold liquids are an innovation of the pottery Neolithic, PN 8500 through 7000 BP. Although shards of pottery from Tel Sabi Abiyad, Syria, were recently dated to 8900 BP. E. Metals. Metals present a complex problem, yet they are pivotal in the development of human civilization. Native metallic copper was cold hammered several thousand years before metals were smelted from ores. Objects of native copper from the early PPNB have been unearthed in the northern Fertile Crescent. Other metals found in their metallic state are gold and silver. The oldest gold objects in the Levant were found in a cave in Nahal Ka'an, Israel, where carbon specimens yielded dates between 5900 and 6300 BP. Given that metals in prehistory were often recycled, gold certainly belongs to the Proto-Semitic era. The fact that Proto-Semitic is attributed to the 5th millennium BCE, whereas the earliest archaeological evidence for antimony is from the early 3rd millennium, can be due to the scarcity of antimony findings. Thus, all Proto-Semitic materials related to metallurgy are 3C. Conclusion. This work has reconstructed Proto-Semitic material names and confronted them with archaeological data of material use on two levels. First, the 2C versus 3C morphology of material names was correlated with the date of their inception. Here, a striking correlation was found. All material innovations of the Neolithic period have 3C structure. All 2C material names refer to materials that were utilized from the Old Stone Age onwards. Lime, perhaps the last material to be given a 2C name, was introduced 16,500 years ago. Although some pre-Neolithic materials, such as skin, have both 3C and 2C names, which we attribute to a word replacement process, they have all preserved a 2C name. Second, we used associations between 2C roots to project further into the past. Thus, the Zur association between flint and rock suggests a culture in which stone was not used for building. The Dar association between circular stone house and round suggests that the term round was in the lexicon before the first stone houses were built. The Gar association between lime and fire suggests that the term for fire preceded the discovery of lime. Both roundhouse building and lime production are innovations of the geometric Kerbian period, from around 16,500 BP. These examples thus consistently point to words of monosyllabic CVC morphology as characterizing languages during the pre-Kerbian period. Furthermore, words such as dor, round, and gur, fire, may date back to the Upper Paleolithic period, if indeed they gave rise to other CVC nouns almost 17,000 years ago. These considerations lead to the pre-Semitic chronology depicted in Figure 1. And just a reminder, Figure 1, a model for the pre-Semitic language chronology and its relation with the corresponding archaeological periods in the southern Levant. In the Upper Paleolithic and the pre-Natufian Epipaleolithic, you have the geometric Caribbean culture, which was the monosyllabic Tusi, and then in the Natufian period, from the early Natufian to the late Natufian, you have the multisyllabic Tusi, and then you have the transition with the pre-Pottery Neolithic PPNA, PPNB, and PPNC, and then you have the Pottery Neolithic, which is 3C. Then finally, you have the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, with Proto-Semitic. Proto-Semites, Proto-Semitic, stems from the old Stone Age cultures in the southern Levant, the Caribbean Natufian cultures. In addition to the incredible time depth suggested by the above analysis, it also indicates that pre-Proto-Semitic speakers may have inhabited the Levant as of the Caribbean period or before. This follows because flint is characteristic to West Asia, but not to East Africa, and the round house is archetypal to the Natufian/PPNA architecture of the Levant. If true, this is a major departure from models which advocate a rather recent Semitic invasion of the Levant. With the evidence connected here, one might envision then transition to the tricontinentalism as a lengthy process which paralleled the increased complexity of the pre-Semitic society, culminating in the transition to agriculture. The nomadic hunter-gatherers emerging from the last ice age still retained the 2C/CVC language morphology of the Upper Paleolithic. As of the geometric Caribbean, certainly by the Natufian society, became increasingly more complex. Permanent stone houses were built to complement the traditional brush huts. Lime was manufactured for hafting weapons and tools, and the sickle was applied extensively for reaping wild cereals. This increased complexity more likely mirrored in the language, which no longer retained its simple morphology. The suggested development bin is interesting because archaeological evidence for the onset of permanent stone house buildings around 16,500 BP suggests that the 3Y root bin emerged after this date. In Proto-Semitic, we already find bun for stone, so that the augmentation, ba'un, must have occurred earlier, most likely during the Neolithic. These two events bracket the formation of the 3Y root bin, which could thus be Natufian. If one were to generalize and assume that all 3Y roots date from the same period, one would obtain interesting conclusions regarding social developments that are not easily assessed from the archaeological evidence. For example, the Stone Age quan between read and the verb root to possess suggests that the concept of personal property beyond one's clothes and weapons first emerged in the Natufian period. Another interesting observation corresponds to the two types of clothes. In Proto-Semitic, sit, which has a Stone Age with buttocks and might have therefore originally depicted loincloths dating to the Upper Paleolithic by its CVC morphology. Kisut derived from the root kis, cover, and hence depicting clothes that cover the whole body, would be Natufian, judging by its CCY morphology. This hints to a change in dress fashion that occurred over 12,000 years ago, perhaps due to the cold conditions during the Young Darius period. Indeed, some Semitic affixes are widespread in Afro-Asiatic, and thus they are presumably innovations of the Natufian PPNA period. Augments continued to pile up throughout the Neolithic. The agricultural revolution, which began with the PPNA wheat domestication, continued with the replacement of hunting by domesticated mammals, the founding of large agricultural villages, the introduction of squared brick houses, and an everlasting quest for new materials. This was apparently accompanied by a revolution in language. Contrary to the implication of the term revolution, it did not occur overnight. The transition to agriculture likely followed many millennia of wild cereal harvesting, penning of wild animals, experimentation in propagating fig twigs, and the like. Eventually, the previous equilibrium was disturbed to the extent of inducing a seemingly spontaneous transition. Analogously, the transition to tree continentalism did not occur overnight. It likely followed many millennia of experimentation in more complex linguistic forms, such as various augments. As these became absorbed into the root, the equilibrium between 2C and 3C words was disturbed, and the stage was set for a new language structure. The correlations revealed in this study suggest that the transition to agriculture, one of the most dramatic divergences in human lifestyle throughout prehistory, was the final catalyst that brought about a period of dramatic language development, creating within a few thousand years a distinctively different language structure. The emerging Neolithic society turned out to be particularly conservative in adhering to the new 3C morphology, which was required for the development of the templatic grammar characterizing the Semitic languages. By the end of the Neolithic, the biconsonantal languages of our hunter-gatherer predecessors had been completely replaced by the triconsonantal morphology that formed the basis for the languages of the great Semitic civilizations of the ancient Near East. Table A1, transliteration, Proto-Semitic cognates with their Hebrew and Arabic equivalents. So as you can see, Proto-Semitic is very important. Proto means first Semitic people, first Semitic language, and Hebrew and Arabic derive from Proto-Semitic or Proto-Semites. Table A1b, consonant mapping. The lost Proto-Semitic consonants depicted by blank spaces in the transliteration table were mapped to remaining consonants according to the scheme below. And as you can see again, we have Proto-Semitic, the first Semitic language, first Semitic people, Proto-Semitic, PS, and then we have Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ugaritic. And we can see that Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ugaritic all derive from Proto-Semitic and Proto-Semites. All of this is very important because Proto-Semitic derives from pre-Proto-Semitic and earlier pre-Proto-Semitic. Our main focus was on pre-Proto-Semitic because from these pre-Proto-Semites will come the Proto-Semites, and all terminology in pre-Proto-Semitic evolved in Proto-Semites, their descendants. Then from Proto-Semitic or Proto-Semites, we get all of the Semitic languages and Semitic people groups that we are familiar with today. Now from Proto-Semitic descends West Semitic and East Semitic. The East Semitic would be the Akkadians. Now for the West Semites, they would be your Ethio-Semitic people, the Ethiopians, your Central Semitic, which will come the Arabic, and then your Northwest Semitic, which will be Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ugaritic. But all of these Semitic languages, all of these Semitic people, Hebrews, Aramaic, Arabic, Ugaritic, Ethio-Semites, Akkadians even, all of them descend from Proto-Semitic, Proto-Semites. And then Proto-Semites themselves descend from pre-Proto-Semites or pre-Proto-Semitic. The Caribbean Natufian culture in the Levant seems to best represent the Stone Age ancestors of Semites. Basically, the Caribbean Natufian culture are the best representatives for the early descendants of Shem after the flood, since they are the pre-Proto-Semitic population that would lead up to Proto-Semites and then Semites themselves. This would mean that the ancestral homeland of Semites is the southern Levant. With that being said, what is the Y DNA chromosomal haplogroup of the Natufians and pre-Proto-Semites? According to the paper titled Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus Reveals Core of West Eurasian Ancestry It reads, such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. Also, according to the paper titled Genetics, Egypt, and History, Interpreting Geographical Patterns of Y Chromosome Variation, it reads, it can be postulated that select M35 carriers, speakers from Africa of a stage of ancestral Semitic, pre-Proto-Semitic, entered the Near East. And according to the book In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory, it reads, the presence of Semitic in the Near East might be explained as follows. Early pre-Proto-Semitic speakers would have migrated into Syrio-Palestine before the Neolithic, being taken by their M35 bearers, specifically M35/78, and adopted by populations bearing M89 lineages. Perhaps at the beginning of this period, or near it, marks when pre-Neolithic migrants with haplotype V, E3b, would have established pre-Proto-Semitic in the Levant. The Natufians, pre-Proto-Semites, best represent the Stone Age ancestors of Semites and the Stone Age descendants of Shem after the flood. The Natufians, pre-Proto-Semites, carried Y DNA haplogroup E, which is found abundantly in the ancient Levant, and the Natufians' homeland is the Levant, the same area of pre-Proto-Semites.